what I found with the space industry is really interesting, actually. They have a way that they think about it. And if you say to them, you can't do that because that's not good, they'll go, well, okay, what else? What else do we do? If you kind of say, okay, look, we should do things like this, they go, oh, okay, interesting. Let's have a look at it. So unfortunately, the solution really, it has to come from outside quite often, because their remit is science and exploration. So they can't really do anything outside of their directives. So I think we're starting to see a realization that they want more expertise and starting to invite artists to engage other disciplines into the space industry to learn. And we need that spin-in knowledge.
Hello, everyone. This is the Space Café Podcast, and I'm Marcus. This time, my friends, I did mess up. You know what happened? I picked, during my recording with my guest, I picked the wrong microphone input, so I didn't pick that one. I picked a crappy one. I don't even know which one. And this resulted in pretty bad audio quality on my end. The good news, the audio quality of my guest on the other side is perfectly fine. And this is exactly what you're here for. So almost no harm done. Still, I deeply apologize for the bad audio quality on my end. Today's episode, my friends, is a little bit of a personal one. Maybe it also resonates with you. Because let's be frank, all those global frictions we're experiencing these days, climate change, it can seem overwhelming, to me at least. And so sometimes I feel like this is the moment where we deeply need fresh new ideas. We need bold thinking. The usual suspects seem to not be able to deliver on those new fresh ideas. So this is where we thought, hey, why not listen to the ones who usually challenge our status quo, who usually are, well, in the vicinity of being called troublemakers, rightly so, in a very positive sense. The artists, they challenge any status quo they are confronted with. They rip it apart, sometimes explode it to put it back together in a completely new way, to challenge our perspectives and to imagine new possibilities. So my guest today, Aoife Van Linden Tol, is such a troublemaker, and she uses space as a canvas for imagination, to find solutions not only for space, but also for Earth. In our conversation, Aoife opened my eyes to the potential of creativity in bridging the disciplines, in rethinking, for example, sustainability, in rethinking what it means to be human, rethinking our humanity. So if you ever felt like you wanted to right now hit that reset button to reset almost anything on Earth, if you ever felt like you need hope, you want to sprinkle a little bit of cosmic perspective on your life, this is the right moment. This is the right place today. Aoife Van Linden Tol. Let's go. Welcome to the show.
Artists are very inquisitive, and we want to find different ways to express what we're thinking about at that time. And that's not necessarily that there's one mission. There might be underlying themes. And I think as the older you get as an artist, the more you discover those underlying themes. You may discover them very early on. Some artists do when they're in art school. I discovered some of mine in art school. And then later on, looking back, you realize that there are these reoccurring strands. And somehow that ties into a lot of the work you do, no matter what realm that's in. And I think the other is that, you know, in the arts, you have a lot of small companies, you have a lot of small organizations, and you kind of do everything. You know, you're doing a little bit of everything. It took me a long time to say that I was a producer, a theatre producer in the company that I was running Art for Badger, because I just saw myself as a project manager, maybe, or a kind of somebody who just put things together. You know, I didn't really put a name to it. And it was somebody who said to me, look, you have to put a name to what you do. This is what you're doing. That's the job role that you are actually fulfilling. As well as other roles, I was also making costumes, helping to you know, driving people, organizing people. It's so multifaceted. I think we become these multi-skilled people, and sometimes we don't even realize that we're playing a certain role. I think from that, we then can hop around within any of those. So it might be that I go on to say, okay, yes, I'm a theatre producer. I'm going to produce a piece of theatre. I'm going to help, create this for somebody else, maybe. Or it might be that I decide to design a whole set of masks and start to think about the animal, to start to think about that art form for a while and that expression for a while. And then maybe I'll go on and do workshops for the community for a while, because that's part of my artwork as well, and you might create a piece that has a connection to your community, and then you kind of follow that path for a little while. And then as you get older, you can kind of swap and change them around and sort of pull them in and out as you wish. I think. Is
this a good prerequisite for the current transformation of almost anything on this planet, to be adaptable, to be dynamic? Do you think this is the moment for the artists?
Big question. I think it's always the moment for the artists, honestly, because the artists, and maybe this is the moment for the artists, I think particularly when there's a lot of change and a lot of challenging moments, because the artists reflect society and they reflect the questions, the big questions that we have about ourselves, about humanity, about the way that we behave towards each other. The artists are often the ones speaking out. The artists are often the ones oppressed. The artists are often the one risking themselves to share certain that maybe can help, they hope can help society or communities or, each other. And I think maybe that feels that way because we are in that moment. And I think some people say, do artists change the world? And I say, if they didn't, then why was I arrested? If they didn't, why are they persecuted? Some of the first people to be persecuted when there's conflicts and stuff. So I think for me, it's not a question of do they, it's more a question of how. I think that adaptability is also important, and that inquisitiveness, because they want to find out as much as possible. Artists get very obsessed by certain subjects that they're researching. So there's always, most artists that I know, not all, will go through a huge process of research while they're working on a project, and they'll really diverge all their thinking, and then they'll converge it all again and bring it into certain points that they want to make through the work. Which means that artists are actually a community of incredibly educated, not just trained in arts if they have gone to university and studied the arts, but even if they haven't, they're often highly researched and intellectual and critical people. There's a huge amount of critical thinking that goes on into arts process. I think, for example, I did a whole piece of work around the badger cult in the UK, which you might not have heard of, but there was outbreaks of TB going on with cows, and they wanted to blame the badgers and say the badgers were bringing TB to the farms. There wasn't a huge amount of scientific evidence for this. Lots of other animals have TB, and it's a lot of biosecurity on the farms that weren't working as well as they maybe could have. It's a very complicated issue, but I dove into that issue so deeply that I could tell you now how many buckets of saliva a cow produces every day. It's just such a random fact. But, we get this obsessiveness and we get this interrogative. We want to know the truth, and we want to expose that within the work. And not everybody, but I think certain artists who have this kind of practice, I suppose.
You mentioned something that stuck with me. Artists express what's going on in the world. What is going on in the world as we speak? What's happening?
Okay, so I think we're seeing an increase in polarization. We're seeing a decrease in democracy. We're seeing an increase of misinformation and disinformation, fake news. We're seeing an increase in existential risks. Nuclear, AI, biological warfare, to name a few. And I think we're, in terms of the things that are maybe most scary in the world right now. And I happen to be also working a lot in the misinformation space for the last 3 years. So I've been doing a lot of research around propaganda, misinformation, fake news, particularly in the context of social media algorithms, attention economy. And I think this is a really important aspect, because regardless of, whatever we choose to do in the world, we all need to know how to engage our critical thinking, how to find the truth. And at the moment, there's a lot of this idea of the truth is subjective. There's no such thing as the truth. The truth is whatever you feel. And it's kind of like, well, we actually do have some, depending on what you're talking about, we have some really good ways that we've developed to try to get as close to the truth as we can. And if we ignore those methodologies, then we do make truth this very subjective thing that anyone can manipulate and kind of just convince you. We go back to these kind of the times where, you made someone believe you just by arguing with them, by convincing them. And this is how it was for Socrates, They all stood in a room and just convinced each other. They didn't have evidence, and evidence and scientific thought came from that, but it is no longer that. And we have to hold on to those things and try to make sure people value those things. These scientific methods, these methods that we have learned to, and also who to trust and why to trust somebody or an information source. I think this is really important. But in terms of, I think, the context of space, this is also a really exciting thing happening at the moment. We've got Earth orbit, a lot of changes happening. So as you know, we're looking towards the end of the International Space Station and the rise of commercial space stations. We're looking at moon habitats. We're looking at traveling to Mars. We're looking at deeper exploration into our further from our solar system. And I think we're at the same time discovering so much more and exploring so much more and progressing so much more. And also, I think this is another connection between the arts and sciences. We're asking a lot of the big questions the same. Who are we? Where are we? Why are we here? This is the pursuit of science. If that wasn't a scientific question, then why would we be sending probes out to other outside the solar system? We're exploring, we're trying to discover more about ourselves. And art is a different way of doing that. It's maybe more based on what's inside of us and our connections between each other and the planet that we're on and our interpretation of our cosmos rather than the data. But again, artists will take data and they'll use it. There's also now, I think, a change in how artists are seen and engage with with space, with science, with other forms of industry or other domains of work or interest in that. Artists are now also valued as researchers, and not just, as I said, desk researchers, but also scientific researchers. I think you can see this particularly well in bioscience. And there's been quite a few art projects where artists have sent up biological samples and to see, what's going to happen and kind of discover what happened to them when they come back. So,
what does the artist do differently to the scientist? Because if you have an artist do biological experiments, in how far are they different to scientific inquiry?
I think they ask broader questions. So I think the scientific questions are very finite and limited by certain conditions. So you might want to have a very specific condition so that you can identify a particular factor within your experiment. Whereas an artist may do something similar, but they're also using the investigation to explore more emotional questions or sociological questions or political questions. And I think it's that inquiry into those other realms that allows the artist to that freedom. We have that freedom to do that in a sense, as well as the scientific aspect feeding into that as well.
But please do correct me if I'm going too far, but I'm trying to find an example. Like, for example, if you bring a fungus to the International Space Station, a scientist would do research for the pharma industry, for example. An artist would maybe also ask the question, how does the fungus feel in outer space? Would that be like the difference between the two?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. I think so. And I think also, what's the perspective of the mushroom? What is the perspective of this another being? What does it mean for that to be in space? Art in space is also the domain of art, but also the domain. If we take another living thing into space, it becomes the domain of that thing. That thing exists there. And if we think about fungus, fungus created our planet. Our planet was absolutely covered in huge, unconceivable masses of fungus before it became anything else. So we're also, the idea that we could be bringing something to space that was our initial, thing that sparked our own life is quite an interesting idea, and maybe a kind of jumping off point for people realizing that actually our existence came from these funguses, and where did that come from? And maybe that was coming from a spore in a comet, and
And still, I think they're still dominating our planet, because underneath, they are sort of the World Wide Web, as someone said, the worldwide fungus web of information flow between plants and microbes and whatnot. So still, I think what this all does is it gives us, or it forces us to rethink our place in the world, because we think we're the center of it all. And we're doing a great job at pretending to be so, as we're transforming an entire planet into something where we're not really knowing where this is headed.
If we think about nature as a collaborator, as having its own agency within our visualizations of the future of our existence in space. So, for example, I worked on a project called Sky Lake with Monica Brandick-Lipinska, where we created a design for a moon or Mars living environment, but it's not a habitat as such. It's more like an open environment in craters or maybe quarries where we've been doing mining, for example, if we kind of go down. And the idea was to have a lake, a sky lake above us. So using 2 layers of glass and then water to protect from radiation, using suspension bridge technologies and things like that to create this space above craters and caves as well. So you have this protection within the cave. So you have sunlight, you can take off your suit, you can walk around, you can have the first footprint in the moon dust. And what we talked about was putting the mycelium into a kind of concrete spray of composite, and then spraying that into the walls to seal them up so that it doesn't break and kind of let in the vacuum, but also to let the mycelium start to work its magic and kind of maybe start to terraform. And then we can use that to help terraform the inside. So yeah, we kind of combined, that was a really interesting project, and there was a lot more uptake than we thought. We kind of thought it was this crazy idea, and it's quite far in the future. It's not like something we could build straight away. It would be something you would have to create once we were already able to do mining and kind of creating glass in space, or creating iron, aluminium structures, things like that.
Fascinating. Before we go to the Outer Space Cultural Evolution Lab, is this the proper term, an invention of yours?
Yes. So I started this experimenting at the analog mission that I was commander on at the Analog Astronaut Training Center in Poland and the mission was called MPOL5. And I wanted to create this cultural evolution lab, which was, the concept is really to have a cultural lab in space, the same way you would have a scientific lab. And that cultural lab would have all the ingredients that you might need as any kind of artist. So if you're a musician, you might have musical instruments, or at least the materials maybe to help you create and experiment with musical instruments in space, in zero gravity. Or if you're a visual artist, maybe you've got materials and things that you can use to experiment with visual art in space. And so I created a few projects on this analog mission to see what would happen as a kind of feasibility and kind of start to understand what that might look like.
Before we go into more detail on this, I'd like to find out in this, because I think we're experiencing a global cultural evolution lab at the moment where no one really knows where we're headed. I'm just trying to find out if where the arts, where artists can help us find exits or find new ways. I mean, like, but please do correct me if I'm wrong. I feel like the 1960s or the late 1960s, they were a massive cultural experiment that had huge potential, but then sort of never went anywhere. Do you think the moment we're experiencing right now on Earth, this moment of global friction and separation from one another and whatnot, is a call for a new iteration of cohabitation of society? Because I feel like I don't know why this thought keeps coming up in my mind, but it still feels like the 20th century is still not over. This 20th century is still, at the moment, is fighting for survival. The industrial age is fighting for survival with patriarchal structures and whatnot. And we're slowly inching toward a new version of whatever that is, what the 21st century could be. I'm still not really sure about what it is, but we are experiencing or seeing the showdown of the 20th century against something new. Does this make any sense? And in how far is the artist's role now to come up with new solutions?
I think it does make some sense to me what you're saying. I think there is that a lot of this there's a lot of leveraging of differences that we have been fighting and that we have been in our particular area of the world, I would say, not necessarily everywhere, but let's say progress of more equality, better human rights that has been, we would like to say is been developing over the last century. I think that there has been a lot of pushback on that. And I think you're right. I think there is that fight for maintaining the patriarchy and maintaining that sort of colonial behavior. And but I think ultimately that is all being leveraged by people who want power, and they will leverage anything they can. And I think the real shame is that it doesn't make anyone's life any better, really. And I don't even think it makes rich people's lives any better, because they're already rich to a point where it doesn't matter if they have 5 billion or 10 billion. It's irrelevant. It's then becomes a kind of puppet game. So I think it's, where does the artist fit into this? I think that's really up to each individual artist if they want to be a part of trying to help to depolarize, I suppose, and fight that narratives that are coming out that are really damaging to people. And specifically, I can talk about this idea, that freedom of speech idea, and with, we've got with social media platforms where freedom of speech is king. But at whose expense? And what does freedom of speech really mean? Does freedom of speech mean that you can say anything you want, even if it's a lie, and then other people have to make up their own mind whether you're lying or not? Well, if we already know that you're lying, then why let you do it in the first place? And you're only doing it to manipulate at the end of the day.
To me, this call for freedom of speech online sounds like a call for a louder voice for bullies. So bullies that have not been so, or couldn't be so vocal so far because we had like our societal norms where those bullies didn't have a voice. But now this new freedom of speech sounds like we want to give them a voice for whatever reason. Maybe it's as simple as that.
I think that's, and going back to what you said before, which is like, okay, there's this fight before we turn into something else. I guess my fear, and I think a lot of people's fear, is what if they win the fight, at least for a certain amount of time? Like, how bad does it need to get before the pushback and the kind of saying, no, we don't want this anymore. We want to have a peaceful society. We want to have a peaceful world. I think what it is doing, though, in some ways, is making us examine those constructs in a bit more detail. For example, we're looking at not just racism or colonialism or feminism. We're looking at all of those together. We're not just looking at climate change and who has access to space. We're looking at those in the context of all of those 5 things. And I think those are all really important dialogues going on and things that need to be brought into the space world. There was the new technical session at the IAC called Decolonial Practice. I don't know if you heard about that. It was really fantastic session. And what was interesting about that session is many of the people running it, the people who ran it were artists, but also many of the people putting papers in were artists. And I thought that was really interesting because the artists are the one bringing these questions and these dialogues in to the space world and into other areas as well. So that's, I think, potentially one of the roles they can play. And also, artists have a big voice. People listen to them. They, particularly the bigger they are and the more famous they are, it's a platform like any other. And I think increasingly musical artists, film artists, actors, actresses, are using that voice.
Let's go back to space. Do you see space as a test bed, as a lab for new iterations, for new versions of social cohabitation, as the next step of what we're experiencing right now?
I think this is the dream that everybody has. And I think it's the dream we've had from since the inception of the idea of traveling to space. It was actually the artists and writers who imagined humans in space first, before anyone really believed it might be possible. And it was the artists who inspired everyone else to actually give it a go at the end of the day. And I think we have a kind of dystopic, utopic view of people in space. Our stories are really important, and the way that we imagine that we can be. I think, unfortunately, at the moment, the space industry only has one idea of how we can get there, and that's a very commercial-based model. I mean, it's kind of it's a commercial-based model which relies on, I would say at the beginning, public funding, because the main contractors and the main customers are going to be space agencies and are going to be the countries, national countries. And I think, so there's an interesting kind of quandary there, which is, these commercial space stations are commercial, but they also are creating more access, because in a way, anyone can go. So it's also kind of democratizing space in a strange way. And how that relationship happens in reality, I think we can only... what I found with the space industry is really interesting, actually. They have a way that they think about it. And if you say to them, you can't do that because that's not good, they'll go, well, okay, what else can we do? They don't know how. Yeah, but okay, what else do we do? If you come and say, okay, look, we should do things like this, they go, oh, okay, interesting. Let's have a look at it. So unfortunately, the solution really, it has to come from outside quite often, because they don't, and that's kind of understandable in a way, because the space industry has grown from science and research, and from so its remit was quite narrow. And I spoke to this when I did my artist residence in ESA. It was interesting to hear that, well, they don't have a remit for certain sociological projects or humanities projects, space projects, or arts-based projects. Their remit is science and exploration. So they can't really do anything outside of their directives.
Yeah.
That's not how they were set up. So they don't know how to do those things also. So it's not just now that they don't have even if they change the directors, they don't have the expertise. So I think what we're starting to see now is a realization that they do want more expertise, and starting to invite artists more to kind of engage other disciplines into the space industry to learn. And we need that spin-in knowledge. So
is this happening? I mean, like, are artists increasingly being invited?
Yes, it is happening. It's happening in certain places. And I think mostly because the artists are knocking on the door. And if you get the right person in the right place at the right time, then they'll say, yeah, sure, come in. It's mostly based on, I guess, conversations, in the doors. So this is the kind of first way in which any organization will invite an artist in. They open the doors, artists will come in, have conversations with experts, have tours, look around, maybe even collect some data or some materials, go away and make an artwork inspired by that. And then the other way that this is happening now, as I mentioned, is artists are coming in and actually getting involved in research, maybe even using some of the equipment, maybe even staying for much longer periods and going and becoming really part of the team and working on projects together. So this is like another layer. And I think this is why at SP, we have invited artists. We've launched the first artist in residency ever.
It's the European Space Policy Institute.
The European Space Policy Institute.
Yeah.
So first ever time inviting an artist to work on space policy, which is really another sort of level of inviting artists to get involved.
Wow. Tell us more about that, because this is like the polar opposites of what I could imagine of a meaningful cooperation, because you have like the very rigid structures of bureaucracy, and then you have the free minds of the artist. How does that work?
It works under, actually, very good for us. It works under the structure of the STARTS Prize initiative, which is a long-running science, technology, and arts initiative. It's funded by the European Union, and this sort of progress, as that I've been mentioning, has really been tracked by that, and they have quite a detailed framework. It revolves around the triple transformation of, I think, society, tech, and what's the third one? Green transition. So trying to tie these things together, and they really want artists to go into areas where these things are being developed and help and help kind of look in different perspectives and provide different ways of exploring, different ways of analyzing, different ways of presenting ideas.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us an example a concrete example at what happened at SP with that collaboration?
So at SP, the open call just finished at the end of last year. Mm-hmm. And actually, I'm allowed to announce now that the winner is an amazing artist called Kyriaki Goni from Greece. And she will be spending time with us over 2025. She'll come for various visits. We're hoping to take her to the UN, to UNOSA, to look at that bureaucracy, see how it works. Like, what does it mean to do space policy? She'll hang out with us at SP and discover how we work, our research, so how we bring research and turn that into recommendations for space agencies, nations, the UN, etc., and how we work in sort of short term, long term, and also how we work across not just research, but also engagement and education. And then the context that was set, the challenge that we gave for this residency was European space policy in an age of sustainability. And so one of the triple transformations is green technologies. And we're also opening in 2025 the Center for Excellence for Space and Sustainability. And we have a really need for a focus on that. So I think this is going to be a really nice way to explore, for her to explore. And of course, as we're only launching this project, it's also really interesting to see how that evolves in itself. Going to get involved. What does this Center of Excellence mean? What does it do? And I think one of the first things it's going to do is really try to define what sustainability in space means, because it means about 5 different things right now. If you say space sustainability to one person, they will start talking immediately about something completely different to another person. So these kind of definitions need to be worked on, as well as, how we really harness it for the future of Earth.
How are artists received in those, for artists, alien places? How do scientists, how do policymakers react when you sit at their table?
Better than they did about 6 years ago, I have to say. I mean, I think when I started coming to IAC, for example, I would say I'm an artist, and people would go, oh, okay. And then the conversation kind of ended. And then now you say you're an artist, and people are like, oh, okay, what do you do in space? And I think there is an opening up of the conscience within the space community slowly. There's still a bit of both, but I think there's a bit more openness to what there is and what an artist can do. So if they have had that little door opened, then we can get into a conversation about
Let's imagine that your work as an artist, or the creative side of society in itself, is trying to establish a new framework of a new social framework. So my question would be, is there a common understanding of what a future society could look like? Are there specific overlapses of different versions of social visions that you would say they could be common ground because we all agree on these and that? Is there, because what I'm trying to get at is what kind of society, so if this is the Outer Space Cultural Evolution Lab, is a lab to envision something new. I'm just trying to find out, what is this something new? Are there any things you can already track down and say, hey, this is where all this is headed?
I think for me, the lab is not necessarily modeling something new. It's trying to find it in that space. So it's not just visual artists and I guess, it's broader cultural experiments. And I think the ISS is a cultural experiment. People are already changing their behavior and the way that they move, that they talk, that they socialize. And these habits are of another. It's a new culture already evolving. But then they don't have a cultural expert necessarily tracking all of that. And not just tracking it and studying it, but helping to enhance it, helping to guide it, and actually we have cultural experts since the beginning of humanity. Culture has been evolving consciously. We've made a lot of effort. We've always had a lot of effort in evolving our culture, whether that's through designing fabrics or earthenware, even when we were hunter-gatherers, from hunter gatherers to even to now, we loads of money, like there's so much more money put into arts and the UN than there is in space. And it's seen as a really important part of how we evolve as humans. That cultural element is not just important in itself, but it's an important facilitator. And I think what will be super interesting is having an expert in space, in culture, to help us shape that and experiment and try things out and understand that we don't have to dictate this is how it's going to be at the beginning and then set that, and then that's what we have to follow and prescribe to, because that might not work. And I think there's a fear of being wrong quite often in the scientific world, because, if you're wrong, maybe particularly in space where your project might be multi-generational, you don't want to be wrong. That would be really bad. So we want to open up a bit more and kind of say, okay, this is a space for allowing that evolution to happen over time. And I don't 100% know what that looks like. I think I want to invite more artists, more scientists, more cultural experts. And I think this is, I guess when I talk about artists, it is more about a broader cultural expert, not just an artist. I don't know many artists who are just artists. I think many of us are also explorers of broader culture and relationships that we have in society.
Do you think is Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek vision, is that the way to go still? Because it's still, it dates back to the 60s, but it still sounds very, very visionary still, to have that open, multicultural and degendered society where it's the post-consumerist society, the post-industrial society, where it's not about the money, because everything is being taken care of, because there's an abundance of energy, of free energy through technology. And the replicators, which I'm still waiting for someone to invent, they're taking care of your material needs. So is this a way to go?
Great, but I think we shouldn't decide that. We should be inviting everybody to decide that. And I think that vision needs to be shared with, the benefit for all humankind. This is what they talk about in the Moon Space Treaty, the Outer Space Treaty. But who is doing that, and how are we doing that? And I think this isn't talked about a lot, but the reality of inviting everybody to the table to talk about what this benefit is and who it's for and how that happens and what that utopian vision is. And I think we often talk about in the West, us creating this utopian vision, but we're not, we're still the ones doing that. Right. So I definitely think that the pathways for that, the dialogue of including everybody in that decision-making in the first place, building that utopian vision together, that's not there. And I think we need that. I don't want to share my utopian vision because I'm in a certain part of society where, I could be making many assumptions about other people that I don't even realize I'm doing. So I think it would be my vision and something I hope that I can help facilitate would be to really bring more people to the table to help.
But still, the thing is, this is super interesting because when you're calling now for participation and bring everyone to the table, it's super interesting to see where society is headed at the moment, because it seems like we do not want to be asked. We want the strong decision makers. We do not want to sit at the table. This is what the onslaught on democracy on a global scale is portraying as we speak.
Well, it's much harder. It's much more difficult. And B, yes, it's not really going to conform with the current polarizing narratives that are happening. So I agree with you there. And I'm not 100% sure what the solution to that is, but I think we have to keep trying to look for it.
Yeah. So maybe it's just an episode we're undergoing at the moment, a very painful one, but hopefully it's just an episode.
I hope so.
You have, when I look at your work as an artist, It's interesting to see that you love it. You love explosions. You love to blow things up. Why is that?
I mean, what's not to love? Um, I think, honestly, I think there were so many things that came together about why I love explosions. I think there's the raw power and transformational energy that happens. You know, we're talking about a tipping point where as soon as it happens, in an extremely short moment of time,
Mm,
you have an irreversible change, something that can
mm,
never be put back again. And I
mm,
don't necessarily talk about it in terms of destruction because, of course, being a scientist, there is no such thing as destruction. We talk about a change in molecules, a change in matter and energy. But and even if you were to carve something, you know, you would
mm,
take a block of wood and you'd be chiseling away at it. You'd be
mm,
destroying some part of it. So in that sense, but I do also recognize there is this irreversible change. And I think there's something very powerful about that. And I think it speaks to the human experience very profoundly. And what I've realized is that the human connection with the experience or the evidence of an explosion is very strong. And that can be everything from, I'll give you an example. I have a project Second Story where people give me objects and I explode them and they tell me why. So they tell me the story. And the objects don't get destroyed. I often just explode them in a very particular way. It might be that I burn some of the pages, or I might blow a big hole through it, or maybe I make a mark somehow, treat it, manipulate it in a way that's relevant to the story. And then I give the object back and somebody continues their relationship with that object. And often objects hold a lot of power as well for people. So when you transform it, not only from physically in terms of what it was to what it is once the explosion happens, i.e. burning it, scorching it, making holes, but also from an object like a book into an artwork. And somehow the relationship is different. So people had stories that were related to letting go of things that they haven't been able to let go of, getting revenge, celebrating life, new eras, marking a new era in their life, things like that. And I think this really opened my eyes to the relationship that people have with these powerful moments. And I think it's also a really strong statement to say, and I think this is what really got me in the first place to want to use this instinctively, to use this power, is to say, I'm going to take this form, this power, and use it for something like art, as opposed to something that is used for gaining power, destroying human lives. And when I say that, it's not just that bombs are used to kill people in war. People that design bombs are designing them, the level at which they go to think about how a bomb is going to be used is absolutely incredible and horrifying. There are bombs that are made to not go off when they land. They're very light and they look like little toys so that children pick them up and go off. Yes.
You're kidding me.
And somebody designed that. And I learned about that when I did my explosive training. And I was so horrified that the human imagination could do something like that. And so I think it's really important to highlight that and to question that and say, why has that been allowed to exist? The fact that we can create this power, I mean, it is amazing. There are incredible explosions in nature, which are also very inspiring for me. The Big Bang, electricity, lightning bolts, even our magnetic field has explosions in it from the magnetotail. There are huge explosive snaps that happen when parts of the magnetic field go off into space behind the Earth and out into space. And supernovas, you know, this is super inspiring. And I think it's part of nature. This force is a part of nature that we've harnessed, and we should really be responsible to use it in a beautiful way.
Beautiful. I'm still thinking about because it still resonates with me very much when you mentioned the role of the artist, and when artists come to a table, everything and get shifted, but is usually improving or contributional to the status quo. So would that mean that in the end, everyone, no matter what what field we're talking about, everyone could contribute from having a different voice at the table, no matter where that voice comes from, because it brings a different perspective on things, and you can only benefit from different perspectives. Is that the way to potentially also think?
Absolutely. And I think this is, I mean, I'm fighting the artist corner because I'm an artist
Of
and I'm
course.
in that field. So, but I think there are lots of other fields that need to be at the table. And I think, interestingly, the artists are also bringing those voices in. What I think also might be interesting just to say in terms of the role of the artist in space is also looking at where arts is applied to other fields such as psychology. You mentioned a moment ago, long trips to Mars.
Mm,
And I worked on a project with Dr. Tamara Russell, who has created this Dragon Way to Mental Health and Wealth. And we adapted it for the space environment for long duration flights. And it uses arts, mindfulness, and clinical psychology so that astronauts can manage their own psychological well-being and psychological safety, which is the most important thing for maintaining equilibrium within high-performance teams.
mm,
And I think that's a really good example of where arts can be used. And it's really important because they're not going to be able to get the support that they need. And they're going to have to open up, which is really hard for astronauts because they're all
mm,
alphas.
mm,
Any kind of weakness could be seen as you not being able to do your job very well.
mm,
And so you would never want another person to
mm,
know if you were suffering from something.
mm,
And it creates a methodology that allows people to talk to each other
mm,
without feeling too exposed, feeling supported, feeling like they can express. And you don't always even need to tell somebody else what's wrong. You can just tell them what you need. And I think it's really important because a lot of psychological
mm,
that ideas are all data driven, and they want machines and they want the astronauts to fill things in. And it's not an enjoyable process, and it's
mm,
not that effective. And I think it's understanding where to create something, a solution that is data driven and digital driven and tech driven, and numbers driven, and where to create a solution that is actually something that we actually have a long history of on Earth as well with arts therapy. I mean, it's kind of spectrum in terms of what we were working at isn't really art therapy, but there's a kind of tradition there that's long looked at.
Right.
And the other thing I think I wanted to say was just about not to forget the sort of economical powerhouse of the arts world. And in terms of these commercial space stations, they're looking at industries to work with, and they forget about the arts. And the arts is a huge, it's more than 3 times bigger than the space industry, and includes gaming and gaming and film, TV, fine arts, and there's a lot of expertise there. And a lot of the arts that happens in space is very, I don't want to say amateur, but it could also be, it's either student-led or it's kind of novelty. It's an entrepreneur coming along who maybe doesn't know that much about arts and wants to do an amazing art, which is great. And I think all of those things have a place. But if you want to look at an industry where you could have basically there's a zero TRL, there's no TRL limitations. You've basically got something that's ready to go. I would say that's also could be a valuable asset in terms of helping this new era begin, if that makes sense. So if we look again, going back to this idea of access to space and who is providing this benefit and access to space, it's often the artists that are creating projects or it's often art projects that are giving access to space. So a lot of these postcards in space projects that are going up in the commercial
For
flights.
artist projects.
Yeah, the Moon Gallery is an open project. So and actually all you need is to have found out about the project somehow, and a way to make an object for the Moon Gallery, and then a postage to post it in. And if you can do those three things, then you can take part. And I think it's often these art projects that are providing the access. Whereas there's, and when I say access, I mean actual access to space, objects going into space, things going into space, people going into space. So yeah, I think that's also interesting. And even the Moon Gallery, you don't have to be an artist. You could just be somebody with a good idea. Some of the people who've submitted are not artists, but they got their piece in the collection. And that's open at the moment for the moon trip. So they have had their International Space Station trip, which one of my artworks was a part of. And now they've got the open call for the moon.
Fantastic. Aoife, there's a question I keep asking my guests on every show, and now I'm asking it to you. If the call came, would you go into space?
Yes. I guess it depends where. I'm a bit scared of going to Mars right now, I have to say. I don't fancy that. I just think it's too bleak and too far, and I don't think I need to go there. If it was to go to the International Space Station, or to go up enough of an amount of time to do an experiment or a few experiments, then I would love to. Yes.
Now, for the question I'm trying to ask, the space station is too short a journey. So you would need to at least go to Mars, because then things get interesting. Because my question to you, if you go to Mars, after a couple of weeks or a couple of days of initial excitement, things will wear off quite quickly, and things can get quite boring on very long distance journeys in space. So my question to you, we have a playlist on Spotify. It's called the Playlist for the Aspiring Space Traveler. And each of my guests contributes one of their favorite tunes to entertain them on the boring rides, on the boring journeys. What's your contribution to that playlist?
That would have to be, I think the one that's going around in my head at the moment is John Hopkins. I can't remember the name of the track, but it's one of his big tracks that is...
We would need the name of the track, because I'm literally putting it on the playlist.
Okay.
John, so you're looking it up?
Yeah, let me look it up. John Hopkins. Wait, I should have it on my Spotify list, actually. A, B, C, and I'm in a P. Luminous Spaces by John Hopkins.
Fantastic. I'll put it online once we're airing that show. And my last question to you, Aoife. This is a coffee place, the Space Café Podcast. And now and then in coffee places, you energize yourself with an espresso, a very strong shot of coffee to energize your body. Now I challenge you to energize our minds and share with us a shot of inspiration, an espresso for the mind. What would be your Aoife Van Linden Tol shot of inspiration?
I'm thinking about something Naum said, a friend of mine, in his TED Talk. I haven't got the exact quote, but the artist's connection with the cosmos has been happening since the beginning of time, as I mentioned, drawing the stars, telling stories in the stars across all different cultures. And I find that incredibly inspiring, because I think it's deeply rooted to who we are as humans. Not just the stars themselves, but the stories that we tell, connected to the cosmos, connected to the stars. And I think how we continue to explore those stories as humans and how we express those stories is going to be super interesting. And I don't know where it's going to take us. I can only use my own imagination. But I'm kind of quite excited that lineage will be continued. But I'm slightly cheating there because I'm kind of stealing Naum's.
I love it. I love it. No, brilliant. Aoife, thank you so much for taking the time and being here in the show.
Thank you for inviting me. Well, I mean, Emma kind of put us in touch, but yeah, I was really happy that she thought of me.
And that's a wrap, my friends. Thanks for listening. I hope this conversation with Aoife Van Linden Tol was as inspiring to you as it was to me. If so, consider sharing it with someone. I know I keep repeating myself, but I think it's a nice gesture to share something inspiring, a good idea, a good moment, a moment of inspiration with someone important in someone's life. I think this is important. I think this is what our time needs as a drop of water. I will see you again in 2 weeks from now. Thank you for your loyalty. If you like what you're hearing, you know what you have to do. No, I'm not telling you anything what you have to do. I would ask you to consider giving us a review, giving us a rating on the podcast platform that you usually hang out. That's the language algorithms understand. And other than that, keep looking up to the stars. The sky's the limit. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. See you in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.